Section 1. The Endless Convoy. August 25th, 1944. A dirt road somewhere between Cherbourg and Chartres, France. The night was thick with the hum of engines. Diesel fumes hung in the damp air as headlights sliced through the darkness, thousands of them crawling forward in an unbroken line. From a distance, it looked like a river of light, winding through the hills. To the exhausted German scouts watching from the hedgerows, it was something unreal, something they had never seen before. Private Franz Müller adjusted his binoculars and squinted through the gloom. "It's been 3 days," he muttered. "They haven't stopped once." Beside him, Sergeant Weber tapped a cigarette nervously. "They can't have that much fuel," he said. "No army moves supplies like this. Not without rail lines. It's impossible." But it was happening. The trucks, olive drab GMCs, Dodges, Studebakers, rumbled along the muddy roads without rest. Each carried barrels of fuel, crates of ammunition, and sacks of rations, marked with white stars. Every few kilometers, military police waved them through intersections, marked with red circular signs. Red Ball route, priority convoy. The American Red Ball Express had come alive. Inside one of those trucks, Private First Class Harold Johnson, a 20-year-old driver from Georgia, gripped the wheel tight. The truck shook violently over potholes, but he didn't ease up. The orders were clear: keep moving, no matter what. He hadn't slept in 26 hours. The only thing keeping him awake was the tin mug of black coffee rattling in the cup holder, and the rhythmic roar of the convoy around him. The men driving these trucks were mostly African-American soldiers, mechanics, laborers, and drivers who had been told they would never see the front lines. But now, in the summer of 1944, they were the artery of the Allied war machine. Without them, Patton's tanks would run dry in less than 2 days. As Johnson's headlights illuminated the back of the truck ahead, he saw a message scrawled in chalk on the tailgate: "No gas, no guns, no glory." He smiled wearily. That was the truth. Each driver carried more than just supplies. They carried the momentum of an army that had broken through Normandy and was racing across France. Behind them, the beaches were overflowing with crates and fuel drums. Ahead of them, General George Patton's Third Army burned through thousands of gallons of gasoline every hour. The Red Ball Express was born out of desperation. After the breakout from Normandy in early August, the Allies were moving faster than anyone expected. Their supply lines, designed for a slower advance, were collapsing under the speed of success. Railroads were destroyed, ports were clogged, and trucks were the only option. So the Americans did something no one else could have imagined. They built a non-stop highway of trucks, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No civilian traffic allowed, no stops, just a roaring, unending flow of supplies, stretching over 700 kilometers from Normandy's beaches to the front. German intelligence tried to make sense of it. They captured maps, intercepted radio chatter, and sent reconnaissance planes over the roads. But the convoys were everywhere. At night, their headlights looked like endless comets streaking across the countryside. During the day, dust clouds marked their path from horizon to horizon. In Berlin, a colonel from the Wehrmacht's logistics division scribbled a note in disbelief. The Americans appear to possess unlimited fuel and transport. Their supply activity is beyond comprehension. For the men on the ground, it was pure endurance. Every mile meant fighting mud, mechanical failures, and Luftwaffe strafing runs. But the trucks rolled on, through shattered villages, burned-out fields, and makeshift bridges held together with planks and rope. By the end of that first week, over 6,000 trucks were running on the Red Ball route. Each carried up to 5 tons of cargo. By the end of the month,
They had delivered more than 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Private Johnson didn't know the numbers. All he knew was that every time he dropped off his cargo near the front, the tank crews cheered. They saluted the drivers as heroes, even if the rest of the army didn't yet see them that way. As dawn broke, Johnson's convoy reached a rest point outside Chartres, but they didn't stop. Mechanics refueled the trucks on the move, tossing rations and fuel cans into the beds. Johnson wiped his eyes, started his engine again, and joined the endless line. Behind him, another column rolled forward. Ahead, another disappeared into the horizon. To the Germans watching from the shadows, it was a sight that shook them to the core. Because this wasn't just a supply line, it was the sound of an empire being built on wheels.
Section 2. Patton's Hunger for Fuel. September 1st, 1944. Somewhere east of Chartres, France, the engines of the Red Ball Express thundered through the early morning mist, while, far ahead, General George S. Patton's Third Army stood poised on the edge of triumph and exhaustion. Patton paced beside his command jeep, slapping his riding crop against his leg. "We're moving too damn slow," he barked, glaring at the map laid out on the hood. "If we had fuel, we'd be in Germany by now." His staff officers exchanged uneasy glances. The great armored advance that had swept across France was grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because of empty fuel tanks. Patton's Sherman tanks consumed gasoline at a staggering rate, nearly 2 gallons per mile. His army, numbering hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, needed more than 400,000 gallons of fuel every day, and that fuel came from one place, the trucks of the Red Ball Express. He turned to his logistics officer, Colonel Charles Codman. "I don't care how you do it," Patton snapped. "Get my tanks moving again. If the Red Ball drivers have to run on fumes, tell them to push the trucks back on the Red Ball route." That was exactly what they were doing. Private Harold Johnson's convoy rolled into a temporary depot, where mechanics worked under floodlights, shouting orders over the roar of engines. "Fill her up. Get her back on the road," shouted a sergeant waving a clipboard. The smell of gasoline and sweat filled the air. Drivers leaned against their trucks, gulping coffee, some with eyes half shut from fatigue. A corporal from Chicago muttered, "Man, I swear Patton must be drinking this gas himself." Another driver laughed. "Long as he keeps killing Nazis, I'll drive till my wheels fall off." The camaraderie among the Red Ball drivers was fierce. They called themselves the Rolling Thunder. They painted nicknames on their trucks: Black Beauty, Miss Liberty, Hell on Wheels, Georgia Peach. Many had never been trusted with combat roles before, but now they were proving that victory depended on them. And make no mistake, it did. On the German side, the situation was unraveling. Army Group B, retreating eastward under relentless Allied pursuit, had expected the Americans to slow down once their supply lines stretched thin. That was how war worked, or at least how it used to. Colonel Ernst Kruger, a logistics officer under General Model, wrote in his field journal, "They are advancing faster than their depots can possibly supply them, yet somehow their fuel never runs out. Their roads are alive with motion, truck upon truck upon truck. It is beyond reason." The truth was that the Red Ball Express was defying reason. The route spanned hundreds of miles, looping from the port of Cherbourg through Alençon and Chartres to the front near Verdun. It was run like a living machine. Each truck was numbered and scheduled. Convoys were spaced 15 minutes apart, and any vehicle that broke down was immediately pushed off the road to avoid slowing the flow. If a driver got lost or delayed, he was ordered to return to base empty. No excuses. In the words of one officer, "You don't stop the Red Ball, you keep it rolling." By early September, the convoy system was moving more than 5,000 tons of fuel per day, much of it going straight into the jerrycans of Patton's tanks. In turn, those tanks kept driving east,
crushing resistance in Lorraine and pushing toward the German border. Still, it came at a price. Drivers like Johnson rarely slept more than 3 hours a day. They endured dust, storms, rain, blown tires, and attacks from German fighter planes. The Luftwaffe had begun targeting Red Bull convoys, strafing them from the air. When the drivers saw the black crosses swoop overhead, they didn't scatter. They kept driving, zigzagging through machine gun fire while clutching the wheel. One after another, trucks burned along the roadside, their cargo exploding in orange fireballs. Yet, the convoy rolled on. Behind every destroyed truck came 10 more. From the hills outside Metz, a captured German officer watched through binoculars as another endless line of vehicles stretched across the horizon. He lowered the glass, stunned. "This," he whispered, "is not an army. It's a factory that moves." The American genius wasn't just in the fighting, it was in the supply. Every drum of gasoline that reached the front was a triumph of logistics, sweat, and sacrifice. The Red Bull Express was proof that in modern war, steel and courage alone weren't enough. Victory belonged to those who could keep their engines running, and the Americans, it seemed, could keep them running forever.
Section 3. The Men Behind the Wheels. September 10th, 1944. The French countryside near Reims was soaked in rain. The roads turned to rivers of mud, but the trucks still came thundering through the downpour. Tires churning deep trenches into the earth, engines roaring like 1,000 mechanical beasts. Private Harold Johnson leaned forward over his steering wheel, his uniform drenched, wipers squeaking rhythmically across the glass. His partner, Corporal Eddie Brooks, sat beside him with a .45 resting on his lap, eyes scanning the roadside hedgerows. "Feels like the damn road's swallowing us," Brooks muttered. Johnson just nodded. "As long as we don't stop," he said, gripping the wheel tighter. "The moment we stop, we're done." The convoy ahead vanished into sheets of rain. Every few minutes, a flash of lightning illuminated the endless column of trucks, each one carrying the lifeblood of Patton's army. In the darkness, the Red Bull drivers pressed on. Most of them were young African-American soldiers, men who had been told they'd never see combat, who had been handed shovels instead of rifles. The army was still segregated, and opportunities for black soldiers were rare. Yet when the Red Bull Express was formed, it was these men who stepped forward to drive the trucks that would decide the fate of the campaign in France. By the end of August, over 75% of the 23,000 Red Bull drivers were African American. They drove day and night, often without headlights, often without sleep. They ate cold rations behind the wheel, used empty gas cans as makeshift toilets, and sang blues and gospel songs over the roar of the engines to stay awake. One driver later said, "You'd see that convoy stretching out in front of you, just lights disappearing into the dark. You didn't know where it ended or where it began. You just drove. Because if you stopped, somebody somewhere didn't get their ammo." Every man carried his own talisman, a photo of family, a cross, a lucky coin. Some trucks had small flags fluttering from the hoods. Others had messages painted on the side: Harlem Express, Sweet Home Alabama, Hitler's freight service. The camaraderie between the drivers was like nothing else. They called themselves the wheelmen, and though the army saw them as labor troops, they knew the truth. They were soldiers of logistics. Back in Reims, a captain from the Army Transportation Corps stood in a muddy command tent, listening to the radio. Reports crackled in from the field. Dozens of trucks had broken down in the last 48 hours due to the mud. Several convoys had been strafed by German planes near Swiss, and yet the supplies were still moving. A lieutenant approached, soaked to the bone. "Sir, I just came from the route north of Trice. Those colored drivers out there, they ain't quitting. They're fixing their own trucks on the side of the road and getting back in line." No complaint. The captain smiled faintly.
"That's the Red Ball," he said quietly. "You can't stop it." The Germans tried. Small ambush teams from retreating units would sneak onto the roads at night, laying mines, or cutting trees to block the path. But the Red Ball drivers adapted fast. If the road was blocked, they simply made a new one, driving through fields, ditches, or even through ruined towns, to get back en route. In one incident near Argentan, Johnson's convoy came under sniper fire. Bullets cracked through the air, pinging off the side of his truck. "Hit the gas," Brooks shouted. Johnson slammed the accelerator, and the truck surged forward. The drivers didn't stop. They never did. Behind them, MPs returned fire and cleared the road. Within minutes, the convoy was moving again, unbroken. To the Germans watching from the forests, it was madness. No army in history had moved supplies like this, not at such speed, not with such relentlessness. By now, word of the Red Ball Express was spreading through Allied ranks. Tank crews, artillerymen, infantry, everyone knew those trucks by sound. When they heard the low rumble of engines approaching, men would cheer, waving their helmets in the air, because they knew what it meant. It meant more shells, more fuel, more food. It meant they could keep fighting. For Harold Johnson and the men like him, that was in. They didn't need medals or headlines. They had their mission, their truck, and the road ahead. Always the road ahead. And somewhere in the distance, General Patton's tanks roared forward again, fueled by the hands of men who were never meant to be heroes, but became them all the same.
Section 4. The Road of Fire and Dust. September 18, 1944. The Red Ball Road near Verdun was a battlefield of its own. The air shimmered with heat as the afternoon sun beat down on miles of road scarred by tire tracks, bomb craters, and burnt-out vehicles. The smell of diesel, rubber, and scorched metal filled the wind. Private Harold Johnson's convoy rolled past the smoldering remains of a truck hit by a Luftwaffe raid the night before. Its cargo, hundreds of jerry cans of gasoline, had gone up in a thunderous explosion that turned night into day. The twisted chassis still smoked in the ditch, a grim reminder of how thin the line was between duty and death. "God," Corporal Brooks muttered from the passenger seat. "One spark, and we'd all be gone like that." Johnson didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the road. Every man in the convoy knew that a single stray bullet or backfire could ignite the trucks around them. They were driving with death strapped behind them. The Luftwaffe's harassment had intensified. The Germans, desperate to slow the Allied advance, began sending Meteor-109s and FRAD 190s to strafe the supply lines. The Red Ball trucks, lumbering, unarmored, and filled with fuel, were perfect targets. When the sirens sounded, the convoys didn't scatter like ordinary soldiers. Their orders were clear: do not stop. Instead, they drove harder, faster, swerving wildly through gunfire as tracers stitched across the road. One eyewitness later described the scene. "Dizzy. Imagine hundreds of trucks roaring through the French countryside, enemy planes screaming overhead, explosions in the fields, and yet the line never breaks. They keep moving, one after another, like a heartbeat that refuses to stop." The Germans couldn't believe it. In captured reports from the Wehrmacht's logistics branch, officers described the Red Ball Express as a logistical phenomenon. One colonel wrote, "Dizzy. No amount of destruction seems to halt their flow. Their transport appears endless. For every convoy we destroy, another two appear behind it." That was the American secret depth. For every driver killed, another was trained. For every truck lost, two more were repaired or replaced. The U.S. Army's supply capacity was so vast, so industrially overwhelming, that even chaos couldn't stop it. At the port of Cherbourg, fuel ships unloaded around the clock. Thousands of men filled jerry cans, sealed crates, and rolled barrels onto the waiting convoy. The Red Ball route had become a living artery of war. From ship to soldier, without pause, it was no longer just a supply operation. It was a rhythm, mechanical, relentless,
unstoppable. The road itself told the story. Clouds of dust hung over the countryside like a brown fog. Locals along the route called it La Route du Tonnerre, the Road of Thunder. Villagers would stop and watch as endless columns of trucks roared past, day and night, their engines echoing through the valleys. Children waved small American flags. Old farmers stood silently, tipping their hats as the convoys passed. France had never seen anything like it. Inside the trucks, life was simple and brutal. Drivers snatched sleep when they could, sometimes in the cab, sometimes on top of their cargo. Food was canned beans, bread, and instant coffee. Letters from home were rare. Showers were rarer. But they kept driving. Every mile they conquered brought Patton's spearhead closer to Germany. Every gallon they delivered meant another Sherman tank could roll forward. Another artillery battery could fire. Late that night, Johnson's convoy pulled into a temporary refueling point, a muddy field lit by the glow of lanterns. Mechanics and dispatchers ran between trucks, shouting over the din. The drivers, hollow-eyed and exhausted, stayed in their seats as soldiers climbed aboard to top off the tanks. A young lieutenant, clipboard in hand, leaned in through Johnson's window. "You boys head out in 10 minutes, he shouted. "We got tanks dry near Nancy. They need fuel before dawn or they're stuck." Johnson just nodded. His hands trembled from fatigue, but he tightened his grip on the wheel. The truck's engine coughed to life again. As the convoy rolled out under the pale moonlight, Brooks lit a cigarette, its ember glowing faintly in the dark. "You ever wonder if the Germans even understand what we're doing out here?" he asked quietly. Johnson smiled faintly. "They'll understand when their tanks stop moving." Far to the east, that was already happening. The German war machine, once fueled by precision and planning, was now paralyzed by shortage. Fuel dumps were gone. Supply trains lay wrecked. Tanks sat idle in fields, their engines cold, their crews waiting for fuel that would never come. Meanwhile, the Red Ball Express roared on through the night, and somewhere out there, German officers stared at the endless line of headlights snaking across the horizon, and realized the unthinkable. The Americans weren't just winning battles, they were winning the war of movement itself.
Section 5. The Machine That Ate the Roads. September 25th, 1944. The Red Ball Express had been running for just over a month, and it was already consuming everything in its path. What began as an emergency measure had become an unstoppable logistical beast. Over 6,000 trucks rolled across France every day, burning through 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to deliver gasoline. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it didn't matter. The front demanded fuel, and the Red Ball delivered. The roads, however, were paying the price. French highways built for horse carts were now torn apart by endless convoys of heavy vehicles. Asphalt crumbled, bridges sagged, and entire villages shook as the trucks thundered past day and night. Dust clouds rose so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. Private Harold Johnson could barely see the truck ahead. His world was a blur of dust, noise, and fatigue. The convoy stretched out endlessly before him, taillights fading into the haze like red ghosts. "Can't even tell if I'm driving straight anymore," Brooks muttered, squinting through the windshield. "Just keep your eyes on the guy ahead," Johnson said. "If he hits a mine, you'll know where not to go." Brooks laughed softly, shaking his head. It wasn't a joke. They'd already lost 2 trucks this week to hidden explosives, left by retreating Germans. Every few hours, MPs on motorcycles would pull alongside the trucks, waving them through intersections, keeping the traffic flowing. Military police units worked like orchestra conductors, guiding thousands of vehicles through an unending ballet of motion. There was no time for hesitation, no margin for confusion. A single stalled truck could back up miles of convoy. At each rest depot, supply officers worked like engineers, feeding a great engine. They mapped out routes, refueling schedules, and repair points. Mechanics toiled around the clock, patching bullet holes, replacing axles, welding torn metal, and sending the trucks right back onto the road. One sergeant from the Transportation Corps looked over the rolling line and said simply, "This isn't a supply system. It's a living thing. It eats roads and breathes diesel."
The efficiency was staggering. Every gallon of fuel traveled from ship to tank in less than 3 days, a record that stunned even Eisenhower's staff. The Red Ball Express wasn't just keeping up with Patton's Third Army, it was keeping up with history's fastest-moving front. But the strain was brutal. Many drivers went weeks without proper sleep. Tires burst, engines overheated, brakes failed on mountain passes. Some men hallucinated from exhaustion, swerving off the road before being jolted awake by the crash. Still, the system worked, because the men refused to fail. The French locals began to recognize the Red Ball drivers as a new kind of hero. Villagers would come out to offer water, bread, or fruit as the trucks roared through. Children ran alongside waving, their laughter mixing with the rumble of engines. Johnson waved back when he could. Sometimes he'd toss a stick of gum or a chocolate bar, small treasures from army rations that brought wide smiles in return. But not every encounter was so peaceful. As the convoy neared the town of Commercy, a sudden explosion ripped through the road ahead. A truck carrying ammunition had been hit by a hidden mine. The blast tore the vehicle apart, scattering debris across the route. Johnson slammed on his brakes, the tires screeching against the dirt. "Jesus!" Brooks shouted, shielding his face from flying gravel. Flames leapt into the sky as soldiers rushed forward, dragging survivors from the wreck. The MPs waved their arms frantically, shouting, keep moving," and they did. The damaged trucks were pushed aside, the fire doused, and within minutes, the line was rolling again. No ceremony, no pause. The mission never stopped. By the time night fell, the convoy was deep in the Argonne forests. The stars were hidden behind clouds of dust and smoke. Inside his cab, Johnson's hands trembled as he lit another cigarette, the orange glow briefly illuminating his weary face. "Think they even know what we're doing out here?" Brooks asked quietly. Johnson exhaled slowly. "Doesn't matter if they do," he said. "Long as that tank up ahead keeps rolling. We've done our job." Up ahead, far beyond their headlights, Patton's divisions were advancing again, fueled by their effort, their grit, and their refusal to quit. And for the first time, the Germans began to understand that this war wasn't being won just by soldiers on the front lines, but by the men behind the wheel.
Section 6. Shock in the German ranks. October 2nd, 1944, west of Metz, France. The war had turned strange for the German officers stationed near the front. Their maps no longer made sense. The Americans were advancing faster than any army had a right to move. Supply depots were still being relocated when reports came in that Patton's tanks were already beyond them. Inside a half-destroyed farmhouse converted into a command post, Major Erich von Reinhardt, a staff officer in the German 11th Panzer Division, studied aerial photographs with disbelief. The images showed lines, long continuous lines, of trucks snaking through northern France. "They're everywhere," he said quietly, tapping the photo. "Every road, every field route. It's as if the Americans have endless convoys." A young lieutenant stepped forward. "We believe it's a temporary surge, Herr Major. Their supply system must break down soon. No army can sustain this speed." Reinhardt sighed and rubbed his temples. "We said that last month. Yet every time we destroy a bridge, they build another. Every time we hit their supply depots, they conjure new ones." He pointed to the photos again. "Look here. These are not rail lines. They're trucks. Tens of thousands of them. And they never stop." That realization rippled through German high command in disbelief and fear. For years the Wehrmacht had prided itself on efficiency, precision, and mechanization. They had pioneered blitzkrieg, the art of lightning war. But now, they were being outmatched by a nation whose industrial power dwarfed their own. The Americans, it seemed, were fighting a new kind of blitzkrieg, one powered not by tanks, but by logistics. Reports from German field commanders confirmed the nightmare. Captured American prisoners spoke of a massive, non-stop truck operation called the Red Ball Express. Thousands of drivers,
Hundreds of miles of dedicated roadways, convoys so thick they formed a continuous river of movement. One Wehrmacht colonel wrote in his diary, "They move with a rhythm that defies destruction. Day and night, the sound of their engines echoes across the land. They bring war, as if it were an assembly line." And indeed it was. Back on the Allied side, the Red Ball Express had grown into an industrial phenomenon. Over 900 companies of drivers and mechanics worked around the clock, ensuring that the arteries of supply never stopped pumping. Engineers had even set up field radio networks to coordinate convoys, turning the operation into a moving, breathing organism. At one temporary depot, General Eisenhower himself inspected the operation. He stood on a rise overlooking the highway, watching the endless line of trucks roll past, each marked with the distinctive red circular sign that gave the express its name. Turning to his staff, he said simply, "Without these trucks, we lose the war." For Eisenhower, the Red Ball Express represented the American genius for improvisation, the ability to turn chaos into organization, to turn manpower into machinery, and to move an entire army faster than any enemy could respond. For Patton, it meant momentum. His tanks no longer waited for supply. They surged ahead, punching holes in German defenses, faster than Hitler's generals could plug them. But for the Germans on the ground, men like Major Reinhardt, it meant something dark. It meant the end of any illusion that the Reich could fight a war of attrition. Reinhardt walked out of the farmhouse that night and looked toward the west. The low hum of engines drifted through the valley, a distant steady thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. He knew that sound now. He'd heard it for weeks. It was the sound of trucks, endless trucks, moving forward, mile after mile, carrying fuel, shells, and food to an enemy that refused to slow down. "They have built a road that never ends," he said quietly, "and it is rolling straight into Germany." Behind him, artillery rumbled in the distance as Patton's tanks pressed closer, and for the first time, the German officers began to whisper what none dared say aloud: "We cannot outfight what we cannot stop."
Section 7. The Breaking Point. October 10th, 1944. The borderlands near Nancy, France. The rain had returned, turning the Red Ball route into a nightmare of mud, exhaustion, and danger. But the convoys didn't stop. They never did. Private Harold Johnson's truck groaned under the weight of 5,000 gallons of aviation fuel. The tires slipped in the muck. The chassis rattled like bones. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Beside him, Corporal Brooks checked his wristwatch. It was 3:47 in the morning. They'd been driving for nearly 20 hours straight. The wipers squeaked endlessly as the road disappeared into the fog. "We're running on fumes," Brooks said. "So are they," Johnson replied, nodding toward the east. He didn't have to explain who they were. Every drop of gas in his truck meant another Sherman could advance, another P-47 could take off, another German position could fall. That was all the reason he needed to keep driving. Behind them, the convoy stretched into infinity. Headlights reflected in puddles, engines coughing through the night air. Somewhere ahead, another truck had broken down, and men were already pushing it off the road to keep the line moving. Each man knew the rule: you never stop the convoy. At a temporary checkpoint near Tull, an MP waved them through with a flashlight, his raincoat plastered to his body. The mud was waist-deep in places, but the flow never ceased. For weeks now, the Red Ball Express had carried the entire burden of the Allied advance. The railways were still unusable, the ports barely repaired, and the winter rains had begun to choke the roads. The system was straining to its limits. Engines failed, drivers collapsed, trucks were cannibalized for parts right there on the road. And yet, through sheer determination, the supply line endured. At a field repair station near Commercy, exhausted mechanics worked by lantern light, covered in grease and mud. "We can't keep this pace," one of them muttered, tossing a broken fan belt aside. These trucks weren't built to run day and night.
A sergeant spat on the ground. "Neither were we," he said. "But we're still here." They were all running on faith and fumes now. Faith that the fuel they carried mattered more than their own exhaustion. Meanwhile, in the German lines, shortages had turned catastrophic. Panzer units rationed every liter of fuel. Tanks were left hidden under camouflage, waiting for orders that would never come. Officers argued over who would get the last few gallons. Some armored crews even siphoned fuel from supply trucks meant for others. One captured German officer told his interrogators, "Our tanks cannot move. We fight on foot now, while the Americans move like the wind. Every day we hear the roar of their trucks. It never ends." That roar, those endless convoys had broken the Wehrmacht's spine. But even as the Red Ball drivers kept the front alive, they were invisible to most of the world. No medals, no glory, no mention in dispatch. The newspapers printed stories of tank battles and city liberations, not of the men behind the wheels who made those victories possible. On the night of October 10th, as Johnson's convoy neared the outskirts of Nancy, enemy artillery opened up from the hills. Shells whistled through the dark, slamming into the fields on either side of the road. The ground erupted in fountains of mud and fire. "Keep going," Brooks shouted. Johnson slammed his foot on the pedal. The truck lurched forward. Its engine scream. Explosions thundered around them. Tracer rounds streaked the air. And yet the convoy pressed on. The men didn't drive for medals. They drove for the soldiers waiting at the front, for the tanks that needed them, for the victory they could almost taste. When the shelling finally stopped, the convoy emerged from the storm of smoke and shrapnel, battered, scarred but still moving. Johnson looked into his rearview mirror and saw the lights behind him, stretching endlessly into the night. "We made it," he said softly. Brooks just nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "And we'll do it again tomorrow, because tomorrow, the war would still need fuel. Tomorrow, the Red Ball Express would still roll, and somewhere the Germans would still be listening in the dark, wondering how an enemy could keep fighting when their tanks should have run dry weeks ago."
Section 8. The Germans take notice. By late October 1944, the German High Command had begun to realize something extraordinary. No matter how much destruction they inflicted, no matter how many bridges they blew or air raids they launched, the American supply lines refused to die. Captured reports from Wehrmacht field intelligence told a grim story. "The Americans possess a mobile logistical system beyond anything we have imagined," one analyst wrote. "Their fuel and ammunition arrive continuously, by road convoys that operate day and night, unaffected by terrain or weather. It is no longer possible to exhaust them." General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg himself, was said to have remarked privately, "We fought our wars by moving faster than our enemy could supply himself. Now the Americans have reversed the logic. Their trucks are their strategy." And those trucks, the beating heart of the Allied advance, were driven mostly by men who had once been told they weren't fit to fight. Inside the German ranks, disbelief turned to frustration. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the endless lines of trucks crawling across France, lines that from above looked like metallic rivers, feeding an unstoppable flood. General von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, slammed his fist onto a map table during a briefing. "How do they do it?" he barked. No one had an answer. For the Wehrmacht, the logistical equation had always been simple. Attack the enemy's supply lines, cut his fuel, and watch his armies die standing still. But the Red Ball Express had rewritten the rules of war. The Luftwaffe, desperate to stem the tide, began targeting the convoys with low-level strafing runs. American truck columns were easy to spot on open roads, but hard to destroy. They moved in tight formations, headlights off at night, escorted by armored jeeps, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. Private Johnson's unit was hit twice in 1 week. The first time a Messerschmitt Bauern's 09 swooped down and strafed the lead truck, tearing the windshield to ribbons.
No one stopped. The drivers swerved, dodged, and kept rolling until the fighter ran out of ammunition and disappeared into the clouds. The second time, the Luftwaffe never arrived. American P-47 Thunderbolts were already waiting overhead, because the same fuel the Red Ball drivers carried kept those planes in the air. Each link in the chain protected the neck. At night, the Red Ball convoys could be seen only by their taillights, tiny red dots glowing faintly through the fog. From a distance they looked like a scarlet serpent twisting across the French countryside. That's how the Germans described it in their reports. Der rote Schlangenweg, the red serpent road. The serpent never slept. In some sectors, German spotters claimed they could hear the trucks miles away, long before they appeared. The low growl of engines became a sound of dread, a reminder that the Americans were coming, fed by an endless stream of gasoline and steel. German infantrymen joked bitterly among themselves. We shoot one Sherman, and 2 more arrive before nightfall. Their fuel must fall from the sky, but there was no magic in it. Only discipline, organization, and the courage of tens of thousands of drivers who refused to rest. By early November, the Wehrmacht's commanders were forced to accept a hard truth. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply operation. It was a weapon, a logistical assault that struck deeper than any artillery shell. When a captured German colonel was questioned about why his unit surrendered near Metz, he gave a simple, weary reply: because your fuel trucks never stop. Even our tanks envy your drivers. He wasn't wrong.
Section 9. Triumph of Logistics. November 5, 1944, near the outskirts of Metz, France. The war was moving fast, faster than most could keep pace with, and the Red Ball Express had become the lifeline of Patton's unstoppable advance. Every truck, every driver, every gallon of fuel was now part of a machine larger than any one soldier or officer could fully comprehend. Private Harold Johnson had just finished delivering a load of gasoline to a forward tank depot. The Sherman crews cheered, waving their helmets in the air. Johnson's own exhaustion was overwhelming, but he allowed himself a brief smile. In the mud and chaos, in the roar of engines and artillery, he could see the tangible impact of his work. Patton's tanks, fueled by the relentless efforts of the Red Ball drivers, crushed German positions in Lorraine. Artillery units fired without pause. Infantry moved with the knowledge that their tanks wouldn't stall. The front moved like a tide, relentless, consuming, advancing. For the Germans, the nightmare was complete. Army units found themselves cut off, tanks stranded, supplies running dry, morale plummeting. Commanders tried desperately to slow the advance by sabotaging roads and bridges. Yet every attack was met with adaptation. When one route was blocked, another was cleared. When a truck was destroyed, another rolled past. Almost immediately, the scale of the Red Ball Express was staggering. By now, over 12,000 tons of supplies were moving daily along its routes. Thousands of drivers rotated shifts with barely a pause. Mechanics patched vehicles around the clock, and military police orchestrated the flow with clockwork precision. Even the local French population marveled at the spectacle. Villagers would watch from hillsides as headlights stretched like fireflies into the night. They offered bread, water, and encouragement to the drivers, who barely had time to nod in thanks. The Red Ball Express had become a symbol of hope, not just to the Allied soldiers, but to the liberated towns and villages in its path. For Johnson and his comrades, there was no fanfare. They drove because it had to be done. They drove because if they didn't, the tanks would stop, the guns would fall silent, and the soldiers at the front would have nothing to fight with. German officers recorded their astonishment in dispatches. One wrote, "The Americans are not limited by terrain, night, or weather. Their supply lines are endless. It is as if the earth itself moves for them." By the end of November, Patton's Third Army had reached the Sayre River, its spearhead still sharp and relentless. The Red Ball Express, though strained, had achieved what few could imagine. An army of trucks, driven by men often overlooked,
had become the backbone of one of the fastest advances in modern military history. And while battles were fought in towns and fields, the real victory had been written on the roads, through mud, dust, rain, and darkness, by the drivers who refused to stop. In countless barracks and depots, letters home were written in a tired scrawl: "But we're making history out here. Don't worry, we'll get them the fuel. We'll keep Patton's tanks moving." No medals could match their achievement. No parade could capture the scale of their contribution. Yet the truth was undeniable. The Germans had been defeated not just by guns and tanks, but by a highway of trucks that never stopped. Private Johnson wiped the sweat and grime from his face as he climbed back into the cab of his truck. The headlights ahead glimmered like stars in the night, the endless convoy stretching on as far as the eye could see. He glanced at Brooks. "Tomorrow, we do it again," he said. Brooks nodded, lighting a cigarette. "Yeah, and the next day, and the..." Because the Red Ball Express didn't sleep, it didn't falter, it didn't stop. It was more than a supply line. It was the heartbeat of victory.
Section 10. Legacy of the Red Ball Express. December 1st, 1944. The roads of northeastern France were lined with frost, the first hints of winter chilling the air. Yet the Red Ball Express still moved, a relentless chain of trucks stretching across the countryside like veins of steel and diesel. Private Harold Johnson wiped his frost-covered hands on a rag and climbed into the cab of his truck. The engines rumbled awake, a deep, steady sound that had become almost comforting over the past months. Around him, fellow drivers prepared to depart. Once again, snow dusted the mud-slicked roads, but no obstacle could halt the convoy. For Johnson and the men of the Red Ball Express, their mission had long become bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about trucks or fuel, or even tanks. It was about ensuring that every soldier at the front had the tools to fight, to survive, and to advance. Every mile they drove was a lifeline. Every barrel delivered a silent triumph. The war was far from over. Patton's advance would push into Germany, and the Red Ball Express would follow, keeping the momentum alive. The Germans had learned an uncomfortable truth. Victory wasn't just about firepower, it was about supply. No army could outfight the Americans' industrial might. No army could outlast their logistical genius. Back in Berlin, reports trickled in describing the American supply miracle. German commanders, long trained to rely on attrition and blitzkrieg tactics, were forced to confront a new kind of warfare. One colonel wrote, "We can destroy their tanks, shoot their planes, and cut their railways, but they keep moving. Their trucks are everywhere, and they never stop. It is unlike anything we have faced." The legacy of the Red Ball Express wasn't measured in medals or newspaper headlines. It was measured in lives saved, in tanks kept moving, in towns liberated, and in the pace of the Allied advance that Germany could not match. It was measured in the countless young men who drove through exhaustion, enemy fire, mud, and snow. African American soldiers who had been underestimated, ignored, and marginalized, yet became the backbone of an army. Years later, historians would call the Red Ball Express one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in military history. Thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of drivers, operating non-stop, day and night, delivering fuel, ammunition, and supplies at a rate that astonished friend and foe alike. Private Johnson would tell his grandchildren about it in quiet tones, describing endless headlights cutting through the night, engines echoing through valleys, the smell of diesel in the cold air, and the camaraderie of men who refused to stop. He would tell them about the thrill, the fear, the exhaustion, but also the pride. The Red Ball Express had shown the world that wars were not only won on the battlefield, they were won on the roads by those who kept moving when everyone else thought it impossible. And as Johnson's convoy rolled eastward into the frost-bitten morning, the headlights stretching into infinity, it was clear that the story of the Red Ball Express would never be forgotten. For every German officer who had watched in disbelief, every soldier who had wondered how the Americans kept moving,
And every historian who would study the campaign decades later, the lesson remained the same. Victory runs on fuel, courage, and an unbroken line of trucks that never stop.